I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we assess the latest manoeuvres in Kursk, look at how Indian munitions are finding their way into Ukraine, and consider the latest in Ukrainian politics and culture.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 19th of September, 2 years and 213 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and staff writer at The Spectator, Svitlana Morenets. First though, over to Dom for the latest on the evolving military situation.
Well, thanks, Francis. Hello, gang. Let's start up in Russia, starting in Kursk region. So Russian efforts at a counterattack are continuing there. Now, I'm not using the word efforts as a pejorative in a bid to only report good news from Ukraine. That's not what we do here. That's not the pod that David created. But I use that word efforts because whilst it's correct, we think, and it's very difficult to get ground truth, but we think Russia has retaken some ground, particularly in the West. But there don't seem to be any joined up operations. They seem to be very tactical nibbles. They're not working together. There doesn't seem to be a coherence to the Russian counterattack. It's if it is such a thing, it's sort of tactical actions rather than any coordinated whole, if you like. And Ukraine has expanded to the west, that box, that area from the west of their lodgement contained between the border to the south and up to the River Seym and the high ground there. Ukraine has continued to push into that area. However, generally doesn't seem to be a lot of movement from either side. Now, that is essentially the picture inside Ukraine. There have been more small Russian advances, particularly up in the Luhansk sector, very minor shifting of positions in the vicinity of Kursk. I'm tempted to say nothing's happened there, but of course it is still extremely violent and there is a lot of action. But in the grand scheme of things, nothing is moving forward there for Russia. That hard shoulder that Ukraine seems to have been able to have established now for about 2 weeks. I think they pushed in, I've seen reports of 3 brigades, again, depending on the size of the brigades and what have you. But that hard shoulder does seem to have had an effect in there, but not a lot of movement. Now, elsewhere, the Ukrainian Air Force said they shot down all 42 drones launched by Russia overnight, as well as one Kh-59/69 variant guided air missile. They say Russia also launched 3 S-300 or 400 missiles from Belgorod towards Kharkiv. Now, no casualties were reported in the city of Kharkiv, but there were casualties, dead and injured, elsewhere in that oblast and across the country in Kupiansk, Zaporizhia, Sumy and Kherson oblasts, and also Dnipropetrovsk, where high-rise buildings and educational facilities were hit, among other locations. That last there coming from Dnipropetrovsk Oblast Governor Serhiy Lysak. I've just seen in the last few minutes, I'm looking for verification, but I've seen reports that in a latest package of arms support, Germany may well be sending Ukraine around 20 Leopard 1A5 tanks, plus a few, 60,000 is the number I've seen, of 60,000 155mm artillery ammunition and some other bits and pieces, but yet to see that reported widely. So I do trust the source I've seen that on, but I just wanted to double source it, but bringing it to your attention for now. And elsewhere, I just pointed towards a great scoop by Reuters today. They've done a big report saying that artillery shells sold by Indian arm makers have been diverted by European customers to Ukraine, and tellingly, India has not intervened to stop that passage, to stop that trade, despite protestations from Moscow. Now, Reuters are citing this to 11 Indian and European government and defence industry officials, and Reuters have done their own analysis of commercially available customs data. Now, they say that this route, this trade, if you like, has been going on for more than a year, according to the sources and the data. And they say the Kremlin has raised the issue directly with India on at least 2 occasions, including during a meeting just in July between Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his Indian counterpart. That last there, Reuters sourcing to 3 Indian officials. Now, among the European countries sending or said to be sending Indian munitions to Ukraine are Italy and Czechia, the Czech Republic. Now, that the latter, they're leading the initiative, the 8 procurement programs supporting Ukraine, one being artillery, then you've got armoured vehicles and drones and AI and all the rest of it. But the Czech Republic, Czechia, leading on the artillery ammunition initiative. Now, they've been trying to source artillery shells from outside the European Union. We have previously reported on President Petro Pavel's initiative to get artillery ammunition from elsewhere. We wondered where he was going to find it all. You may remember at the Munich Security Conference in February this year, he suddenly announced that he'd found a supply of hundreds of thousands of 155mm artillery rounds. We were discussing at the time, we were debating which sofa he had shoved his hand down the back of and managed to find hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds. I think we know where the home furnishings were, and it seems to be India. But no, really good story there from Reuters. To go and have a look at that today. And that's us up to date for now.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. As you say, a really interesting story in Reuters there, and something I'm hoping that we'll be able to return to later in the week or early next. As we, of course, approach the major sessions of the UN General Assembly, which begin on the 24th, it's interesting to see the way various countries are pitching their perspective on the changes they would like to see to the makeup of that organisation. Not because it's going to happen, but just to register the way that this war has sharpened perspectives. The Finnish President Alexander Stubb has said that he supports expanding the UN Security Council, abolishing single-member veto rights and booting out Russia, he told Reuters yesterday, saying he is going to be calling for those reforms. Now, as we've discussed goodness knows how many times together, Dom, it ain't going to happen because there's no institutional means for it to happen because of the veto, unless Russia or China agree to it, which they certainly won't in this geopolitical moment. So logically, one could, it's extraordinary, conceive of a scenario where, let's say in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, a greatly weakened power that is totally non-representative of its former standing could still sit at the top table of the UN Security Council just by virtue of the fact that it was once powerful. A bit like how historically a country like Venice, when it was a city-state, was still belonging to entities like the Holy League and others, despite its greatly weakened status as a military and political power. But it was there by virtue of its former standing and symbolic status. The only way it would be conceivable for Russia to be removed, as we've discussed before, is if legally one were to put forward a case that it was the Soviet Union, not Russia, which was given a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. But even if that were to be put forward as an argument, China wouldn't agree to that. So really, it is for the birds, frankly, and the UN is seemingly an immovable object. But that's not to say that one doesn't register the appetite for change in the UN. As I mentioned yesterday, when I was at the UN security meetings and at the General Assembly last year in September, so this time last year, it was very noteworthy sitting through God knows how many speeches from all manner of countries, big and small, the appetite for change that was there. And I remember, Dom, that when you interviewed John Kirby, that he was saying that the United States even was open to changes within the UN. But realistically, I think in the medium, maybe even the long term, it's going to be very difficult to see there being any actual way for those changes to be agreed by the relevant parties. But nonetheless, there is an appetite for change, particularly from countries like Erdogan's Turkey and India, etc. There is an appetite for movement, but I don't think we're going to see it anytime soon. There's just too much at stake for too many countries. But really, I want to majorly focus on the European theatre today and Russia's actions in former Soviet-controlled territories. From Politico, we learned this week that Moscow allegedly paid and trained a ring of insurgents in a bid to overthrow Armenia's pro-Western government earlier this year. Prosecutors in the country have said before local security forces disrupted the alleged plot. We spoke about this a little bit at the time, some of the rumours around this. According to the officials, 6 Armenians were recruited to undergo undergo 3 months of training in Russia and were paid monthly salaries of 220,000 rubles, which sounds like a lot, but it's only about $2,500, while learning how to use weaponry. They also reportedly underwent background checks and polygraph tests to determine their allegiances. Polygraph tests famously not especially reliable, but nonetheless they did undergo them before being transferred to a military base in Rostov-on-Don, southern Russia. Now, relations between Armenia and ally Russia have soured since Moscow invaded Ukraine, with the South Caucasus country freezing its membership of the Moscow-led CSTO military alliance, dispatching humanitarian aid to Kyiv, of course, and staging joint drills with US forces. At the same time, Armenia's longtime rival Azerbaijan has forged closer relations with the Kremlin, with its president holding talks with Putin in Baku last month, as we discussed. So an interesting situation. But let's turn northwest of Armenia to Moldova next, where former chief of the Moldovan General Staff, Igor Gorgan, whose espionage activities The Insider exposed in an earlier investigation, again something we mentioned at the time, has now been charged with high treason. Just to recall, The Insider gained access to Telegraph correspondence between former chief of the Moldovan General Staff, Igor Gorgan, and his believed GRU handler, Russian Colonel Alexei Makarov. Gorgan regularly reported to him on Moldova's domestic political situation and provided information on visits from Ukrainian Ministry of Defense representatives who came to Moldova to purchase military equipment. Gorgan served in the General Staff until late 2021, when the country's new Western-leaning President Sandu requested his resignation. Before 2023, the mass expulsion of Russian spies working in Moldova under diplomatic cover, Gorgan managed to secure a post at the UN, leveraging his remaining connections in the Moldovan Defence Ministry. At the same time, it's believed he continued to be a key GRU informant. Now, Moldova, as listeners know, remains one of the geopolitical fault line nations between Russia and the West at present, with serious anxieties about alleged political unrest and interference being stoked by Moscow insurgents there, with security implications for bordering Ukraine, of course. Georgia, too, is another political front line. And an interesting snippet here in Britain, which would just mention very briefly, is that British Airways have announced that they will launch direct flights from Heathrow to Tbilisi from March 2025, operating 4 times per week. I think we know where we can have our next jolly, Dom. A sign of increased traffic between the two countries, perhaps. That might be logical given the unrest that we've covered there this year. Thoughts welcome. It may also be a signal of growing political ties between the two countries. But as I say, welcome listeners' perspectives on this, and it'll be something that we'll hopefully return to the next time we're talking about Georgia. Now, turning to the EU specifically now, MEPs have just passed a resolution calling for EU member states to lift current restrictions hindering Ukraine from using Western weapons systems against legitimate military targets in Russia. This has happened just within the past half an hour or so. So I'm just looking at the text fresh, as it were. It was adopted with 425 votes in favour, 131 against and 63 abstentions. Ukraine cannot fully exercise its right to self-defence, the resolution said, and remains exposed to attacks on its population and infrastructure. To quote the resolution fully, the Parliament underlines that insufficient deliveries of ammunition and restrictions on their use risks offsetting the impact of efforts made to date and deplores the declining volume of bilateral military aid to Ukraine by EU countries. MEPs reiterate their call for member states to fulfil their March 23 commitment to deliver 1 million rounds of ammunition to Ukraine and to accelerate the delivery of weapons, air defence systems and ammunition, including Taurus missiles. They also restate their position that all EU countries and NATO allies should collectively and individually commit to annual military support for Ukraine militarily of no less than 0.25% of their GDP. So pressure being put on EU nations with regarding the weapons permissions by the EU as an institution. Just bears repeating, Britain is not a member of the European Union, but nonetheless there are other countries like France that are key in those discussions taking place, we understand, with Washington around Storm Shadow permissions, for instance. And indeed that reference to Taurus missiles there that I drew attention to is putting pressure on Berlin. Now, in Kyiv, there have also been some significant votes this week. The Parliament has passed in the second reading a draft law which closes serious corruption loopholes in construction procurement projects. It was initiated by the head of the Anti-Corruption Committee, with the Anti-Corruption Action Centre and its partners having been working on this law draft since before the beginning of the year. Also, perhaps more significantly, the Rada voted this morning to rename 327 settlements that had names related to the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, following on from legislation passed outlawing most Soviet and communist symbols, street names and monuments as part of a decommunization process in 2015. Zelensky then signed a law in April 23 that banned naming geographic sites in Ukraine after Russian figures or historical events in response to the invasion. So this process is ongoing, echoing other efforts taking place in former countries that were once under Moscow's control. I find this a really fascinating subject, and it's something I'd like to get into a deeper dive in a future episode, because there are some elements of it that become complicated when you have figures who are perhaps associated with both Russia and Ukraine. Are they people who should, in a sense, fall under that blanket of just being considered Russian? Or are there nuances here that become quite difficult? Listeners may recall the episode I did on the famous writer Bulgakov, for instance, and the Bulgakov Centre in Kyiv is somewhere that has come under some criticism for its associations with the Russian Empire, despite the fact that Bulgakov, for many, wrote one of the key accounts of the Ukrainian war for independence. So it gets complicated, as history always is. But since we're on the subject of culture, fascinating and brilliant to have Svitlana Morenets of the Spectator here with us in Telegraph Towers. Svitlana, thank you for coming in. Let's start on this legislation being passed in the Ukrainian parliament. I wonder if you can just give us a sense, first of all, of how ordinary Ukrainians are experiencing these state-mandated shifts away from the Soviet past. It's very easy to talk about these things in the abstract, but as listeners will know, it was always something that David was very keen that we do, is this perspective on how ordinary people are experiencing these big blanket policies. What small or big things have changed as part of these cultural changes? Really interested to hear your perspective, Svitlana. Welcome.
Thank you, Francis, for having me back. I would like to first talk from my experience. I was born in the Khmelnytsky region, which is located in the west of Ukraine. And I was growing up in a Ukrainian-speaking family, and I was going to the Ukrainian-speaking school. But all the books in the local library, all the TV programs, the cartoons, the movies, everything was in Russian. And later, when I grew up and I went to study to Kyiv, to the capital, I was actually bullied for speaking Ukrainian, because at the time, even after Russian invasion in 2014 into Donbass and Crimea, to speak Russian language was seen as something fancy, as being very well educated, and to speak Ukrainian was like to come from a village. It was a result of the years of the Russians' oppressions and them trying to set this ideology in the minds of Ukrainians that they have to speak Russian, to share the Russian culture, and that we were all one people. And yes, Ukrainian government was taking small steps since 2014, trying to rename the streets, but it was insufficient. And only now, after the full-scale invasion, you can see what a change was made, because at the moment we have a lot of Ukrainian music, we have a lot of Ukrainian young singers who before couldn't become popular because of the huge competition with the Russian musical industry. The same goes with the production of Ukrainian movies, about the plays in the theaters. Our media switched to Ukrainian, and I think the full-scale invasion prompted us to really appreciate and to protect our culture and our identity. And one of the reasons Putin claimed he invaded in 2014 and 2022 was because, as he said, Russian language population was oppressed and suppressed in Ukraine. But it was quite the opposite. It was the Ukrainians who struggled to promote our culture. And I think it was the right moment to make that shift because you can see what happened in Belarus, where their language is almost extinct. Only 3% of Belarusians talk in Ukrainian. And now in Ukraine we have the opposite movement. Now more people are speaking Ukrainian. And actually people are shaming each other for listening to Russian music or watching Russian YouTube bloggers because they pay taxes for the Kremlin, and then those taxes go into buying weapons for the Russian army, and they kill Ukrainians. So every time there is a scandal, when there is Apple Music or Spotify updates about what music is the most popular in the country, and if you see there a Russian song that is popular in Ukraine, it is a huge scandal every time, and people discuss how could they continue listening to that, knowing that they indirectly fund Russian war. Some say that changing right now the names of the streets and cities named after the Soviet Union figures or Russian figures is not the right time because it also costs money, because you have to change it in books, in maps, in all the documents. But when else than now? I think I know that most of Ukrainians support this, and finally we see ourselves as a really independent, separate nation from Russia.
Thanks, Svitlana. It's so fascinating, this subject. I know we could talk about it for much longer. But just since we're on the cultural subject, there was a story that we weren't able to cover last Monday for reasons that are well known to all of us. And it's a story about controversy over a particular film which received some plaudits in the West. But can you speak about... Well, tell us first of all about the story, but then explain to us why this has caused such controversy among Ukrainians in particular.
Yes, of course. So at the beginning of September, the Venice International Film Festival screened a documentary by Russian director and former Russia Today employee, Anastasia Trofimova, which was titled Russians at War. She presented this film as anti-war story about the fate of Russian soldiers. She spent with them about 7 months on the front line. So it was scheduled to be shown also at Toronto International Film Festival. And it was the moment when the scandal began, because Ukrainian community, which is very big in Canada, they started protests there again, trying to influence the decision, and the screening was cancelled initially, but then it was renewed again. And it later turned out that the Canadian media organization TV Ontario provided even funds for this movie. So talking more about the film director, Trofimova at the press conference in Venice, when asked about Russia's action in Ukraine, she said the soldiers she spent time with in the Donetsk front line were absolutely ordinary guys, and claimed she saw no signs of war crimes during her time near the front. She said that war is shown in black and white, and the point of view of Russian soldiers is not actually heard. She did not mention the war crimes they committed in Ukraine and the destruction that Russia caused. She didn't mention that Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea in 2014. And she also stated that her country has not participated in war for many years, and that she only read about war in books. So you can imagine the reaction of Ukrainian community and filmmakers who were also at that festival, watching Russian movie portraying Russian soldiers as victims rather than active participants in the war. Many of them did it willingly, and their crimes can become less significant simply because some claim to be unaware of why they are involved in this war. And I think the problem is that the Western community doesn't see this movie as just another way of Russian propaganda to humanize Russian soldiers and Russian invasion. And this movie is said to be now screened even in Zurich, in Switzerland, at the film festival. And all those protests made by Ukrainian foreign ministry are not seem to be heard. So I don't know, we will see how it goes on, but for now it's quite devastating to see that slowly the Russian cinematography is going back to the Western cinemas, and we see what messages they try to promote.
Thanks, Svitlana. A really interesting story, and one that if there are any other major updates on over the coming days and weeks, we will, of course, update listeners on, because, as you say, it did draw a lot of ardour at the time that it's kicked off. Now, changing subjects, we talked about the Ukrainian parliament earlier on, and of course when we've had you on in the past, we've spoken about a lot of the issues that are taking place and that ordinary Ukrainians are experiencing at the moment. Let's turn then first to the democratic crisis in Ukraine and how the government is trying to handle it. Where do you want to start on this subject? What's the latest that you can update us on following the last time we spoke about this?
Right now we have a big problem. Corruptioners fleeing the country freely. We know well that Ukrainian men are not allowed to leave the country, and when they try to do so, most of them are caught very fast, and it's usually a big story showing how well the border security works in Ukraine. But when it comes to the influential people, especially members of Zelensky Servant of the People Party, when they get caught in a scandal, they flee easily. And the latest case was Andriy Odarchenko, who fled just yesterday. He's a member of the Servant of the People Party, and he was suspected of attempting to bribe former head of the State Restoration Agency, who worked on the rebuilding of the destroyed sites in Ukraine. So fled abroad just days after he was released on bail of over £300,000. And this causes such a big outrage in Ukraine, and it's such a strong hit against Zelensky and his ratings, because just 3 weeks ago, another member of his party, Artem Dmitruk, he fled after the prosecutor general's office declared him a suspect due to the attacks on the law enforcement officer and the soldier. As soon as he was announced that he is wanted, Artem Dmitruk fled the country, and again there was a scandal, and Zelensky recorded a video addressed to the nation promising that in 2 weeks the law enforcement officers will show the plan how to combat illegal border crossings. And 3 weeks passed and there is still no plan in sight, and now we have the Andriy Odarchenko who fled too. And it seems quite a scheme right now in Ukraine that people, to avoid justice, to avoid being prosecuted, they just flee the country and with all the money they stole, and they can continue living abroad and keep going with their lives. When Zelensky made his big reshuffle of the government 2 weeks ago, everybody expected that the prosecutor general and the border guard chief will be removed from their positions, because during their work all these men fled the country. But it didn't happen. Instead, Zelensky replaced the foreign minister, the Euro integration minister, and other people who were more or less okay at their positions, but didn't change the people who needed to go. It doesn't uplift the mood in Ukraine hearing all these stories, because Ukrainians want to see the justice served despite of the full-scale war, and unfortunately we don't see it at the moment. It's up to Zelensky to decide when to do these changes in the positions of the prosecutor general, especially because all of this impacts his ratings, and I think he cares about them a lot. So I just wonder why he hasn't done it yet.
Thanks, Svitlana. Always really interesting to hear your perspective on the Ukrainian political situation. Now, before we go to our final thoughts, just one other question I wanted to put forward, which is, of course, about your work in The Spectator. And I know that you had Boris Johnson writing, saying that he as he has for a while now, believes it's vital for Ukraine to join NATO. What did he say in the piece that the Spectator commissioned from him?
I want to quote actually what he wrote about Ukraine joining NATO, because I guess it is the first such an influential politician who clearly stated that. He said that the West should invite Ukraine to join NATO before the war is over. And he says, quote, that is because we could extend the Article 5 security guarantee to all the Ukrainian territory currently controlled by Ukraine, or at the end of the fighting season, while reaffirming the absolute right of the Ukrainians to the whole of their 1991 nation. We could protect most of Ukraine while simultaneously supporting the Ukrainian right to recapture the rest. He says that Article 6 allows to do that because it specifies that countries can be members even if the security guarantee does not apply to all of their internationally recognized territories. It's quite a bold statement from him, and it seems to be quite realistic in the nearest future, because NATO will need all the members to agree for that, and Hungary and Germany, of course, will oppose it. But the other important thing that he said, that the West should provide a lend-lease for Ukraine sufficient to continue the fight and also to give Ukraine the permission to strike Russia with the Western weapons. And also he talks about Donald Trump in his article, and he says he believes that he is the one who could end this war. It's quite surprising for me, because in Ukraine, Trump is seen as someone who make deal with Putin on Putin's terms, just give him some of Ukraine's lands and say the war is over. But I don't know, we don't know about what they talked privately when Boris Johnson went to the US, what they discussed and what Trump told him. So yeah, it's quite surprising that he is not directly, but he is endorsing Donald Trump in the upcoming elections. And I think that UK really has a chance to take a lead on allowing Ukraine to use Shadow missiles. Boris Johnson talks about it a lot, and former British defense ministers. Supposedly next week, when Zelensky will meet Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Kamala Harris, the UN Security Council, he will present finally that victory plan everybody's talking about. We don't know yet what are the terms of that victory or peace plan, but hopefully it will be accepted or at least taken in account by the American leaders.
Well, thank you very much, Svitlana. Always interesting to hear your perspective. Now, we were going to go to final thoughts, but Dom, I understand you're hearing some breaking news about the latest on the German military aid package we were referencing earlier in the week. What are you seeing?
Not earlier in the week, Francis. Earlier in this episode, just as we came on air, I'd seen a few tweets about it. I've now seen the official Ukrainian Twitter feed putting out the details of this latest German aid package, which they say has been delivered, so not promised, actually delivered. There's a lot to it, so I won't go through every single item, but it's going to be 22, or rather it has been 22 Leopard 1A5 tanks, 22 MRAPs, that's the mine-resistant armour-protected vehicles, the kind of all-terrain vehicles that have a V-shaped hull, so if it goes over a landmine, the blast is directed away from the crew compartment, so the occupants generally survive. But so that is not a fighting vehicle, it's more a battlefield taxi than anything, but they are very good. And then lots of other armoured vehicles, including Gepard, which is the air defence, quite old air defence vehicle. It's a sort of tank hull with a big air defence turret on it, 2 twin 25mm cannons blasting a load of lead in the sky to take down drones. Very good at taking down drones. Other armoured vehicles like bridge laying and mine clearing tanks. So that's good. Lots of drones of different names and variants and all the rest of it, but basically reconnaissance drones rather than kind of attack drone, kamikaze drones, if you like. 1 million small arms rounds, always very helpful. 61,000 155mm artillery rounds, air defence radars, and over 100 other soft-skinned military vehicles. So a fairly big old package there from Germany. That's just come out in the last few minutes from the Ukrainian MOD.
Well, thanks, Dom. Earlier in the week, earlier in the episode, it's all the same when you're talking, Dom. Now, let's go to final thoughts. Where do you want to start today?
Thank you, I think, Francis. So I'd point folks to an article by Galia Ackerman, a journalist at the newsletter and website Desk Russie. She's written an interesting piece titled Lessons from Kursk. It's a couple of weeks old, but I've only just saw it. I saw it this morning. I saw a post on social media which directed me to it. But interesting, some of her observations about Kursk sort of directly and then sort of second order effects, if you like. Now, on the incursion, she says, the quote, she said, "The sacred land of our ancestors, which the regime, as in the Moscow regime, seeks to conquer in Ukraine, and for which it is willing to sacrifice tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Russian lives, does not stir much emotion in the Supreme Commander and his entourage when that land is in Russia itself." She then says it's noteworthy the incursion has not provoked particular outrage amongst the Russian population. She says it's as if the entire nation has been zombified, watching what happens to them as though it doesn't concern them. She says Ukrainian drones blow up military planes, refineries, fuel depots, ships and submarines. Residents of nearby towns observe the gigantic fires through binoculars, exclaiming, "Wow, what a fireworks show," as if it were a spectacle. She puts down, or she says this popular apathy suggests that the collapse of Russia, which some people talked about, some people suggested could occur with the fall of Putin. She suggests any such collapse, if it were to happen, may not be bloody. And she says, if the army failed to stand in the way of Wagner's march on the capital during the ultimately aborted coup of June 2023, and if neither the army nor the population stand as one to fight the invader in the Kursk region, how are we to believe that the people of central Russia would rise to defend the sacred land of our ancestors in the Urals, Siberia, the Far East, and the Caucasus? And I think the clincher, I think that's all interesting thoughts, but I think the clincher is this. She says it is the fear of a violent breakup of Russia that restrains the American establishment from providing too much aid to Ukraine, and which pushes the Americans to limit the use of their weapons by Ukrainians. She said the breakup of a state that is strong only in its ability to wreak havoc and which promotes a bloodthirsty and obsolete ideology would be a historic opportunity for the oppressed peoples of the remnants of the Russian Empire, the Tatars, the Chechens, Bashkirs and many others, to finally regain their freedom. So an interesting article there from Desk Russie. I think that idea about is there fear in the corridors of power, no, Washington basically for shorthand, is it the fear of a violent breakup which is hindering policy permissions and greater military aid and all the rest of it? Don't know. What do you reckon? Be interested in your thoughts. But that's me, Francis. Thank you.
It's an interesting but controversial thesis, Dom. Interesting to see what listeners make of it. Just one thing I would add is, yes, that's a good articulation of this sort of idea of ordinary Russians' acquiescence to fate. But I think the idea that the Kursk incursion has not had any destabilising influence within Russia itself is untrue if you listen to the heads of the CIA and MI6 who did that joint statement with the Financial Times and that joint op-ed, where they said quite explicitly that it has caused unease amongst the elite, which of course, for the points that you were just flagging in the article, would be relevant to that conversation. So it's a really interesting piece, and as I say, we'll put a link to it in the show notes for those who have views on it. I imagine we'll have quite a few. But Svitlana, you've waited very patiently for us today. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, it feels very strange sitting here at the Telegraph office with David not being here. And I want to say some things about what he meant for me and for Ukraine when I came to Britain in 2022. And I just started my job at the Spectator as the Ukrainian, reporting on Ukraine. David was the first person to reach out to me and to invite me to the Telegraph to participate in this podcast, but also we became really good friends after that. And he had a really big heart, and he saw that I had no one in London to talk to or to share about the war in my country. And he was very supportive, and he always invited me for meetings. He came to my birthday party. We were really close, and it feels so unfair that he's not here anymore, and one day this war will be over, and I really wanted him to see this day and celebrate it together with Ukrainians in Kyiv, and unfortunately it won't happen anymore, and the only thing we can do is to make sure that his contribution to Ukrainian war effort is remembered always, because you really need to have such a big heart to support the country you are not born it, but anyway dedicate so much time and your life to their cause, and all Ukrainians will be forever grateful for him.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we are relying on your support. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions and give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X, formerly known as Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest's executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.